by introducing myself and how I came to do this kind of work. So I wear many hats, but the main kind of facets of what I do is I'm an artist, movement artist predominantly. I work with clowning, and I've also produced films and worked in events and festivals for quite a long time, so that was a big part of my journey, sort of weird and wonderful journey into coming into this work was filled with that kind of community infrastructure. I also do diversity and inclusion consultancy, and that's through the Collective Liberation Project. So that's kind of my day job and is based on my research into somatics and social justice. So really trying to map where trauma from things like sexism, racism, homophobia really impact our bodies and how we can use body-based strategies to start to kind of undo the grips of these painful experiences and hopefully have more agency to not reproduce these patterns in society. So I do that work mainly with non-profits, also arts organisations, so that's another hat. And yeah, I suppose with my journey with this, it started from doing an international relations degree at the University of Sussex and thinking I was going to be a human rights lawyer and go down that path. And after learning about the kind of mechanisms of these systems, I realised that that was not going to work for me. So I moved to California and became a clown. And in the process of that, met a lot of people who were engaging with social justice works and psychedelic research in more kind of artistic, creative ways. So through immersive theatre, through running installations and things like Burning Man. And so that was the kind of context that really got me engaged in trying to do art and activism slightly differently. And decided to then move back to the UK and try and continue that process. And so I suppose the piece of work that really represents the direction I'm trying to go in more is Regenerate, which I think some of you in the room were at, and Tessie was a speaker on a panel then, so thanks for being here. That was an art festival focused on the intersections of drug policy, racial justice and liberation. So really trying to create a space where we can, feel joy and pleasure in community whilst addressing these topics that are pretty heavy and also at the moment only really spoken about by certain groups of people in policy spaces. So how do we kind of broaden that out and really get the people who are affected by the war on drugs in the room? So that event was kind of an attempt to really start that conversation. So all of my work is really trying to move in this direction of using art with social change, thinking about how we can make all of this as irresistible as possible. As Tony Cade Van Barrett says, we have to make the revolution irresistible. That's kind of what I'm trying to do a little bit. So, drug policy. In terms of my journey in the last few years with that, I have to say it really was an accident. It wasn't something that I planned to get into, but I think through moving in the festival community, living in the Bay Area, it just sort of fell into place. And before I knew it, I was being asked to run a community forum at Psychedelic Science 2017 on racism and allyship in the psychedelic community. It was very well attended and probably the only space at the conference to actually address that issue. And so it kind of made it quite clear that we needed to have more of those conversations and have that on the agenda. From that, I was invited to speak at the Drug Policy Reform Conference the same year on a panel that was about colonialism, racism and psychedelics, and how we heal the harms of psychedelic prohibition. So meaning the ways that during colonialism, indigenous communities and communities of colour were stripped away from their plant medicines and was made illegal. And so how do we now in this psychedelic renaissance sort of repair the harms of that, acknowledge the kind of connections and links that were broken and actively seek to repair that. Then this year, I was invited to go to the Harm Reduction International Conference and facilitate the only panel I had on psychedelics, actually, which a few people were annoyed about. But that was about kind of visioning new pathways and futures with psychedelics and where we see the movement going. Which again, seemed to be a space to talk about social justice. Okay, now it seems like this is going to be legal pretty soon. What do we do to make sure it's accessible? Where is that conversation? How do we really create some urgency around it? And leading through all these things has been kind of a close relationship with MAPS. I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I've been working with them for those who don't know, MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And they're the main sponsor that's kind of initiated this kind of wave, again, of research, particularly with MDMA to treat PTSD in veterans. So they're kind of one of the biggest organizations that are doing that work. I'm now working with them as a consultant to try and make the medicine through expanded access actually accessible to communities of colour, LGBTQ plus folks, because that hasn't really been integrated massively into their work thus far, which we'll talk about later. So, as many of you in the room are probably aware, we are in a moment of psychedelic renaissance. As of today, I'm not sure if anyone has heard that Oakland has decriminalised plant entheogens. So, Oakland! Which is amazing. And this kind of wave is ongoing in terms of decriminalisation, but also kind of public consciousness and awareness, and the amount of research studies that are happening all over the world. I should preface that by saying mainly in the Western world. Though there are countries such as Ghana which are looking to decriminalise all drugs and actually having quite serious conversations about that too. So it is spreading. The MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is probably the most developed and closest to coming to market in a therapeutic capacity. And they estimate that it will be available for therapy in the US by 2021. Phase 3 clinical studies are happening in Europe at the moment in certain sites, and they're estimating, depending on the country, it should be legal for therapeutic use by about 2025. So we're actually not very far away from really having this potentially accessible to some people, if not all, hopefully all, but definitely to some people. And yet, as a civil society, we're not really engaging much in the conversations about how we structure this and how we make sure it's not a matter of corporate capture, which more and more is the kind of current situation. As an example of this, Johnson & Johnson, who produce baby oil and Vaseline, have the patent for ketamine nasal spray, which is now legal and available in California and as a treatment for depression and suicidality. So the corporations are all lining up to make sure that this is going to make money for them. What do we do as civil society to ensure that we can have healing and access to these substances in a way that is regenerative and repairing our harms? So I'm not going to profess to have deep clinical understanding of all of these trials because that's not my role. I'm more of a consultant around how this is made accessible. But some highlighted things which I think are good to talk about within this renaissance in research that's coming out is that MAPS has been awarded kind of FDA breakthrough status. So the Foods and Drugs Administration in the US is trying to fast track MDMA-assisted psychotherapy because it's been that successful that it's pretty likely that phase 3 is going to go very well and is kind of being rushed through, in a sense. MAPS recently released in May 2019 a kind of summary of all the studies they did in phase 2, and you can see that indicated there, that 54.2% no longer were on the criteria for PTSD after 2 sessions with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And that's against 22.6% who were the control group who were just receiving the kind of therapeutic protocol. So therapy in itself is effective, the therapeutic protocol which they've developed, which we can talk about later potentially. There will be Q&A. MAPS are also engaging in studies looking at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for social anxiety with autistic adults, also for anxiety associated with end of life and life-threatening illness. And then there's a whole host of other studies being conducted by other organizations. A couple of my favorites that come to mind is currently a study being done in Israel and Palestine, looking at the use of ayahuasca and somatic counseling to heal trauma and conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. I'm trying to keep a watchful eye on that study because I think it's really, really exciting and powerful work. And there's also, I think, at Johns Hopkins, they're working with various religious leaders, trying to compare psychedelic experiences to religious mystical experiences. So there's all sorts of studies happening. I urge you to look into it over the internet and see what's out there. And also quite recent news, as of spring this year, Imperial in London are actually going to have the first centre for psychedelic research. So we should be seeing a lot more of this work happening in the UK, a bit more overtly. So where did my journey start with this? This is a picture of 2012 Camille at Burning Man for the first time. And I came across Rick Doblin doing a talk about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And it blew my mind. I just thought, what is this? Is this really happening? It's really legal? And obviously at that time it was not where it is now. It wasn't so clear as to sort of, okay, we're nearly at the end point. It was exciting, there was some progress, but it wasn't where we are quite now. So yeah, it obviously took me by surprise and kind of piqued my interest. And since then I've been thinking a lot about how we ensure that this medicine can be accessible to those who really need it and can be packaged in a way that's culturally relevant for communities who are not, say, people that go to Burning Man, people that work in the tech industry, or people that are white and Western. And so in sitting with this question and having conversations with people who work for MAPS and those in my community, it's kind of led me to this position of trying to be one of the voices of ensuring that diversity and social justice conversation is happening with this work, so that it's not seen as a trickle-down solution. Okay, well once it's legal then we'll deal with it, because that won't happen. It needs to really be integrated now. So I'm not talking for this moment. I want to just tell you how the flow of this evening is going to go. So, for me personally, with neurodivergence, I can't sit for more than 20 minutes with someone talking to me about starting to drift off a little bit. So there's going to be some somatic exercises throughout, just to get you to sort of connect with your body if you want to deepen the relationship to this material in this session. Obviously, if you need to go to the bathroom, get a drink at any point, please take care of your bodies, do what feels good to you. There will be time for a Q&A at the end. Overall, aiming for this to be about 1.5 hours, so it's not going to be too long-winded. I'm going to begin.
We've just mentioned there will be a break.
Yes, we're going to also have a break, so that will be factored in there as well. But before we get going into our first section, and then first embodied exercise, I want to just give a little bit of some safer spaces, guidelines for where we are interacting with each other. Because we don't really have many spaces to talk about racism or oppression. It can feel quite heavy and uncomfortable. It's not necessarily an easy thing to explore, even in a passive way. So I kind of ask you to try and really lean into discomfort as much as is possible for you. Stay with your breath and just notice what arises in your body. There might be certain things we talk about or mention that's like, ooh, that feels uncomfortable. I just invite you to notice where that sits for you in your body. If you are doing one of the pair sharing exercises, it asks confidentiality, so to not go and speak about what your partner has just said to you, and just try and keep that to yourself so we can maintain a nice container together. And really ask you to actively listen, so not just to others when they're sharing, but also to yourself, and noticing if there are any revelations that are coming up for you, things in your body that are happening, sensations. So hopefully that feels okay to everyone. So, without going any further, I'm going to invite us to begin with doing a little body scan meditation. So if it feels good for you, if you want to participate in this, just try and get comfortable in your seat. And I invite you to close your eyes if that feels good. And just gently rest your gaze somewhere in the space. And just begin to notice and deepen your breath. Becoming aware of any sensations in your body. And as you inhale, imagining that your tummy is inflating like an expanding balloon, and then deflates with your exhale. And just bringing your awareness to your head, your neck, and your shoulders. Noticing any sensations in these parts of the body. Breathing into any places where there's soreness or tension. And trying to release this with your exhale. And bringing your awareness to your chest and your rib cage. Noticing how your breath affects these parts of the body. And breathing into any places where there's soreness or tension. And trying to release this with your exhale. And bringing your awareness to your tummy, and your pelvis, and your bottom. Noticing how these parts of the body rise and fall with your breath. Noticing where your bottom connects with your seat. Breathing into any places where there's soreness or tension, and trying to release this with your exhale. And then bringing your awareness to your calves, your ankles, and your feet. And just taking the last few deep breaths, just noticing how your entire body feels now. Your heart rate might have changed. Just noticing what's true for you. So when you're ready, just giving your toes and your fingers a wiggle. Opening your eyes and coming back into the space. Okay. So let's get into it. I'm going to start by talking about embodied social justice, which is sort of an area of research that I'm actively engaged in. It's quite new, but there's a lot of crossover from neuroscience, traumatology, feminist, non-verbal research, non-verbal communication research. Lots of really interesting crossovers. And this is a theorist I really respect called Rae Johnson, who's written an amazing book called Embodied Social Justice. So really naming the lived experience of our bodies, our sensations, perceptions and behaviour is really the essential ground of human identity, of how we experience the world and ourselves. And so when we're having an embodied approach to social justice, one that recognises the degree to which our bodies are implicated in the reproduction of social power, this works to support change in the relational fabric of our lives so that structural shifts correspond with authentic transformations in attitude, and where legal rights and freedoms are experienced at the core of our beings and manifested in our everyday interactions with others. So this is really an approach that's stepping away from a very academic tactic that's been used in activism for a long time, of just feeling that if we just give people enough information, then they'll learn how to not be racist, or they'll learn how to not be sexist. They read enough books, watch enough documentaries, we'll sort it out. This approach is actually questioning that and saying that unless we also change the ways our bodies respond to other bodies, the ways that we feel into what feels appropriate or not appropriate in different moments, then the change is actually quite superficial, and we're trying to aim for a kind of more holistic transformation. So with some examples to really ground this, I don't know if any of you heard about the repeal of Section 377 in India. It's kind of the repeal of the colonial era homosexuality, anti-homosexuality law that the British colonialists had implemented. So they finally repealed that, so now homosexuality is no longer decriminalised. No longer criminalised. But it's going to take a long time for the population in India to really adjust to the point where the tolerance for gay people is matched to the legislation. So legislation alone is not enough to kind of create change. It also has to be this kind of inner transformational work. And the same thing can be said for drugs and drug policy. There's so much stigma still surrounding a lot of these substances, even though the research is there, and us in this room might be interested in knowing It will only take, speaking to the wrong person at work or family member to really feel that stigma and the weight of that. So there'll be a lot of work necessary to change the way people feel about these issues. And that's what an embodied social justice approach is trying to do, is that kind of inner transformation, rather than just focusing on policy and legislation alone. So these are some really great books if you're interested in this approach. There are many more, but these are some that have really grounded my research and the workshops I run. Bessel Kolk, who's written The Body Keeps the Score, is a neuroscientist and has done a huge amount of research on post-traumatic stress disorder, and pretty much concluded that PTSD is something that is existing in the body, and unless we actively engage the body in healing, then the patterns don't break down. So he has a range of suggested treatments that are really therapeutic, one of them being therapeutic yoga, EMDR, something else that we use, somatics, a whole host of other interventions that are proving to be very successful. I highly recommend that book. We've already talked about Rae Johnson a bit, for embodied social justice. Joy DeGruy is a psychotherapist based in the US. He's kind of mapped research on African American communities and their trauma alongside a kind of analysis of post-traumatic stress disorder, sort of showing how behavioral traits in both white populations and black populations in the US has really very much been in development in relation to the trauma of enslavement and many kind of behavior patterns that are still dominant today. And the oppression of the body is kind of looking at different systems and how they impact our body, whether that's the prison system, oppression that is experienced through homophobia and sexism, kind of mapping what that looks like to individuals and also groups. Rema Menakem is someone that I'm really nerding out on at the moment. Yep, he's amazing. Somatic psychotherapist, and has also studied with Bessel Kolk and also Peter Levine, somatic experiencing, and has developed what he calls cultural somatics, which is kind of taking an understanding of the African American historical experience of trauma and using rituals that we use within that community to help to engage the body and to kind of break down some of these patterns of PTSD that are very prevalent in communities of colour in the US and around the world. So this again is just kind of a quote really noting that our bodies have a different knowledge than our minds. We typically feel this as constriction or expansion, pain or ease, energy or numbness. And often this is wordless. It's not necessarily stuff that we can have verbal stories about, but it relates to what is safe and what's dangerous. And the body is where we fear, hope, and react, where we constrict or release, where we reflexively fight, flight, flee, or freeze. So in thinking about oppression, which is, and there are many, many different definitions under the sun, so I'm not going to say this is the definition of oppression. This is a definition of oppression that I think is particularly useful when thinking about an embodied approach. Again, it's coming from Rae Johnson, who's defined it as a collective trauma that's perpetuated between groups that exists on a spectrum from microaggressions to macroaggressions. So microaggressions can be defined as these kind of everyday, usually non-verbal interactions with others that send denigrating messages to someone based on their group membership. So some examples from my life could be entering maybe a kind of upper middle class space or a space that's predominantly white, and people turning to me and saying, "Oh, you're so articulate. I didn't expect you to speak like that." Or a lot of hair touching, or just being touched generally. And so having this awareness that in everyday interactions, for those who feel more powerful than someone else, we often normalize being able to touch someone's body, having access to someone's body. This obviously happens in interactions between men and women, where men will often feel, completely entitled to just touch a woman, whether it's like out of apology or not. But there's ways that our bodies have all these methods of reinforcing power and dominance, often in very unconscious ways, and not because people are bad or they're deliberately doing this, but we learn from our environment to reproduce these systems of power also through our body, not just our minds. This paper that's cited is looking at PTSD in controlled studies of Palestinian adolescents, one control group that had experienced a car accident and developed PTSD, and the others who simply, as living as Palestinians in occupied territory, had pretty much the same rates of PTSD, and so who have experienced a major car accident. So microaggressions are not just this kind of like, oh, snowflake social justice concept. It really can be mapped onto the body, something which is having a very physical and psychological effect. And when we think about these social forces that are holding one group back, this is always in direct correlation to another group who are being elevated by that diminishment of that group. So we can't really have an oppressed group without directly affected privileged group. And when we're speaking about privilege, we're just talking about kind of unearned assets that are given to someone in a group because of their social status. And so this could be around race, this could be around nationality, language, gender, sexuality. But it's just a way of kind of naming that. And it doesn't mean that you don't have bad things that happen in your life, that you won't experience trauma, because we all do. But it just means that in that particular facet, that area of your life is not one of the ways in which you're being oppressed. So when trying to get our heads around, what is a kind of embodied understanding of racism or racial trauma, I think it's important to kind of note a common misconception or a bit of a contradiction that we have in our society. I feel like there's a very binary approach to racism when we kind of like to label someone and say, you are racist, or I'm not racist. And we see it as this kind of thing about interpersonal actions, about whether someone is good or bad. When actually as a system, in terms of how our country's been structured and the global power structure of the world right now, it's based on a system of racism. It's been kind of evolved to be as such. So all of us are swimming in this, all affected by it by some way, shape or form. And so this kind of reactive way we've been trained to respond to, like, I'm not racist, it's nothing to do with me, means that we end up not addressing it, not engaging with it, and dissociating from understanding how it relates to our lived experience, or how we perpetuate it. So I think that's the first thing to say, is that it's not just about interpersonal interactions, it's about the system that we're swimming in. And that can be in terms of our institutions, their policies and practices, our cultural norms, what we think is a measure of success or civilization or progress, the interpersonal acts, whether they're microaggressions or bigger acts of violence. And then thinking about the ways that certain communities of colour are excluded, underserved, and how those things manifest as well. So we know it's a system. It's bigger than just us as individuals. But how does that system get reproduced? I don't believe for a minute that most people want to have racism. I think there are some people in the world, but I think that's a smaller fraction. I think most people genuinely want to be loving and kind towards each other. However, by not having an awareness of how this actually works and is reproduced, that unconsciousness means that it's still being perpetuated a lot of the time, even with people with good intentions. And so Rema, coming in with his wisdom, building on this work that Joy DeGruy has done, is really thinking about racism as a form of embodied trauma. So, in defining trauma to begin with, trauma is the body's protective response to an event or a series of events that it perceives as potentially dangerous. So this perception may be accurate, inaccurate, or entirely imaginary. It doesn't matter in terms of what the body does, how the body reacts. So an example of this could be if you're very sensitive, such as I am when you try and watch a horror film. It disturbs me. My body constricts. I might have nightmares. It has a physical effect, even though mentally I know it's not real. It's kind of akin to that. So the body wanted to fight or flee, but wasn't able to do either, so it got stuck in freeze mode. And in many cases, it then developed strategies around this stuckness, including extreme reactions, compulsions, strange likes and dislikes, seemingly irrational fears, and unusual avoidance strategies. Over time, these can become embedded in the body as a standard way of surviving and protecting itself. When these strategies are repeated and passed on over generations, they become the standard response in families, communities, and cultures. So if we're to upend the status quo of white body supremacy, we must begin with our bodies. So this kind of piece around intergenerational trauma is really important. So we grow up in our families or in our communities, we notice the way people live in their bodies, the way they treat other bodies, the way they feel access to touch or not touch other bodies. We learn a huge amount on a non-verbal level. We like to think in the West that we're all up here and it's all about our words, but about 80% of our ways of communicating and reading communication is non-verbal, not verbal. And so these mechanisms of reproducing power structures are often coming from the body, whether it's the way we're looking at someone, allowing them to pass or not pass, bumping into the street into them or not. The body is a really, really powerful mechanism for kind of recreating these systems of dominance or subordination. So I really like that Rema kind of defines this as white body supremacy, because it's a system that's prioritizing certain bodies that are identified as white, regardless of whether their heritage is not of that. It's like, if you're read in that way in the world, there is a certain amount of privilege and superiority that is being placed on those bodies over others. And so, just going slightly deeper into this before we move on, in this definition of white body supremacy, it's kind of all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white, and the practice is based on this assumption, whether that be colonization, dominance of the English language, whatever these things are. White supremacy does not refer to individual white people per se and their individual intentions, but to a political, economic, social system of domination. So the system is based on the historical and current accumulation of structural power that privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group. I do not use it to refer to extreme hate groups. I use the term to capture the pervasiveness, magnitude, and normalcy of white dominance and assumed superiority. So in critical race theory, they really wanted to make a term that was encompassing this historical process. And I think Rema is kind of adding to that, subverting that slightly by embodying it and applying it to certain bodies, so that we have a much more direct and less hypothetical kind of relationship to it. When he's also talking about, I'm going to skip back slightly, these kind of fight, flight, or flee responses, I think about the work of Robin DiAngelo. Has anyone read her work before? She's great. She talks about white fragility, which is this idea that when racism is brought up, sometimes the reaction that you get is a sense of like, what are you talking about? It's not me, it's nothing to do with me. Either like extreme kind of panic, constriction, or aggressiveness, or like tears, or just saying, hey, this thing that happened, da-da-da. And so, that to me is trauma response. And that is a very normalized association reaction that many white people are having when racism is named or when anything of that nature is spoken about. And so I think that's where this kind of fight or flight response is really, I think, speaks to me in the context of Rema's work. But also in many other interactions, which may be in the context of work, or when you think about the police force, which, I'm not going to lie, is very uncomfortable for me to have to get into a space where I was considering the trauma that police officers have and how that then causes them to react to black bodies. But if I think more about it, I think a lot of it is coming from trauma response. It doesn't excuse it at all. But there is such a kind of, sense of danger, annihilate, that's happening. It's not rational. It's not a rational thing. It's an embodied thing that links to trauma, whether that's stereotypes we're seeing and the ways that we perceive and judge others and react and don't see people as safe. So it doesn't make any of it okay, but I think in trying to understand it from the body, we have other pathways to kind of complexify what is going on. This map I find really useful, just to kind of map how interconnected these processes are. Because we sometimes like to think of these things as all separate, over here, they don't have any connection, but these systems have really developed around each other and can't really be taken apart. So again, really coming into this sense that we are all swimming in, living in these systems, and are kind of product of our history. As much as we like to believe we're individuals, we have nothing to do with this, we read The Guardian, it's all fine. Whether we like it or not, intergenerationally, not on an epigenetic level as well, they're looking at in epigenetic science now, we can see that these things are literally being passed to us in our DNA by our ancestors, in the ways that we respond, in the ways that we have anxiety or trauma around certain issues. Often that is literally being passed from our descendants. Ancestors, rather. Yeah, and James Baldwin, who I love very dearly, I think this quote is very apt in that context. You know, history is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. So until we can kind of really understand and almost have a truth and reconciliation approach to knowing what happened in terms of colonization, what happened in terms of enslavement, and the British equivalent of Jim Crow, even not long ago with my mother growing up in this country and the kind of daily racial and physical abuse that she experienced. I mean, it's not very far away, but we really like to think that we're post-racial in the UK. So until we can kind of have an understanding of what happened, how are we able to not make the same mistakes? How are we able to integrate this learning and change the way our bodies actually interact with other bodies? So we have systemic transformation rather than just some legislation that then gets undone. What does it look like to really have that transformation? That's what I'm interested in. So I'd invite you to, in a moment, just turn to the person next to you. We can do it in three if that feels comfortable. And we're going to kind of respond to this quote by Toni Morrison, who says, "No one ever talks about the moment you found out that you were white, or the moment that you found out you were black. That's a profound revelation. The minute you find that out, something happens. You have to renegotiate everything." So, don't participate if you don't want to. If you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable and you're like, "Ooh, I'm nervous," I maybe urge you to push the lead into that a little more and participate. But what I'm going to invite you to do is in pairs. Each going to have, do 4 minutes each to talk about this. When did you realize your racial identity? Is there a particular moment that comes to mind? And as you recall this moment, how did this feel in your body? And really notice if any sensations come up in your body about this memory and association of realizing your racial identity. Obviously, I know not all of you in the room identify as white or black, but whatever racial identity you do or don't engage with, when was that realization for you? Like, oh my gosh, this is how the world sees me. So, yeah, for those who do want to participate, if you turn to the person next to you in a moment, decide who's going to go first, who's going to go second. I'm going to time it, so I'll ring the lovely tinctures, these bells when it's time to swap over. If you're listening first, I would just ask you to really just actively listen. And you can do that by not interrupting your partner, not saying, "Oh yeah, me too," but just silently receiving, making eye contact, listening. Then when it's your time to swap over, I ring the bell and then you'll be able to have a go. If also there are some of you in the space who don't have a partner, then feel free to find someone. Also, there is no pressure to engage if you don't want to engage in this exercise. So, I'm going to give you a couple of moments to find your partner and decide who's going to go first and who's going to go second. Cool. Welcome back, everyone. Just going to move into the last kind of 20 minutes or so before we open up for some Q&A. bring this back to psychedelic community. So if we've seen that the research studies are going really well, we're seeing the healing PTSD, anxiety, depression, it's all looking good. What's the issue? Why do we need to have a conversation about making this accessible for communities of colour and for other marginalised groups? Well, for many reasons, and there's a whole series of really great articles on symposia. If you're not familiar with symposia, I massively recommend them. They had a whole sort of series of articles about social justice, diversity and inclusion in a psychedelic context. And this piece was written by my dear friend Natalie, who works at MAPS. And yeah, it's kind of really naming the fact that there's a lot of different issues with privilege and access in the psychedelic community, not just amongst people who use these substances recreationally, but also within the actual scientific research community, in terms of who is able to get a license in order to facilitate the studies and trials, who is able to be at the right university that is able to have the clout to access the sponsorship, the resource, the funding to do this work. What we're also seeing at the moment, at least in the US context, there are currently only 2 people of colour who are part of research trials out of all of the research sites in the US. There aren't any other POC folks that I'm aware of in the European context. So I mean, it might be safe to assume that they could be the only 2 at present. In terms of research participants as well, the majority of MAPS and the MAP studies have actually been white veterans from the US. So in terms of actually understanding what the healing potential is for communities of colour who are not necessarily just experiencing trauma through being on the battlefield, but might have the double overlap of the trauma from the battlefield as well as daily racism, or daily racism and daily sexism. We don't know how effective the current model is for people who are outside of the kind of identity box of white Western person. And then the third thing that's coming up a lot is that when we do have participants of colour or who are experiencing different forms of oppression that are embodied, there isn't necessarily the competency and the training in the people that are sitting with them in therapy to understand what these dynamics are, how they might come up for the participants in the research, and how best they can support them and actually acknowledge that these things are real and not do further damage by actually re-traumatizing them, by giving microaggressions, by behaving in ways that would probably be unconscious, but actually do quite a lot of damage if people are in a very vulnerable state undergoing psychedelic therapy. So these are just some of the kind of considerations that I think we have to think about when we're having this conversation. At the moment, there is very much a one-size-fits-all approach that's happening. We've made this therapeutic protocol, we've tested it with these people, therefore it will work with everyone. What I and quite a few people I know are interested in is really understanding what would it look like to have MDMA-assisted psychotherapy work for, say, Palestinian people living in occupied territory who can't just escape from their trauma, who are going to be continually re-traumatized by their environment. Is this going to be effective medicine for them? We don't know. So there's a lot that needs to be kind of questioned, and to an extent I wonder if in the space at the moment there's a sense that we just need to get it legal, we just need to get it across the finish line and we can worry about all this stuff later. However, if we don't incorporate these understandings and these questions now, then we potentially are creating a healing methodology that actually isn't healing for everyone. That again is only something that's going to be accessible and beneficial to small groups of people. So these are some of the considerations we have moving forward. The other thing that is the kind of elephant in the room in the psychedelic research community is the war on drugs, which is not talked about nearly enough as it should be. This piece, if you want to read more about the war on drugs in the UK context, was written by myself and my colleague Imani for Vice, really detailing how drug policy operates in the UK context and how it is the main mechanism that's currently used to criminalise, incarcerate and on occasion kill people of colour in this country. All you need to do is associate someone as a drug dealer or having drugs on them, and it's enough to literally kill them, and for most people to think that's okay. As I'm saying it now, I'm sure many of you are like, but that's not okay. But whether that's Rashan Charles, whether that's Mark Duggan, these are just two of many names of people who, in a brief media slur, spin campaign, just said, oh, well, we thought they had a package of drugs on them, as if that justifies being shot and executed by the police. So this is the level of stigma and racialized kind of social control that has been operating through the war on drugs to make us dissociate and dehumanize people to such a level that if we associate them with drugs and they have a certain color of skin, then they're essentially disposable. And if we don't talk about this, when we're also thinking about healing and decriminalization of certain substances, then we're really missing out a huge part of the conversation. Because if we think about the research studies, and if tomorrow, say Imperial decide, okay, we want to make sure our studies 50% people of colour, and they try and do that, and as some of them talk to me and say, we have tried to reach out to more communities, and they're not interested. That's where it ends for them, because they just think they're not interested. They're not thinking about the war on drugs and what that mechanism looks like for people of colour, which means that, you know, it's not the same experience to necessarily just take part in a study using an illegal substance after facing disproportionate criminalisation, stop and search, harassment, and any association with drugs, meaning that you're probably going to be criminalised and put in prison. There are more barriers there that need to be worked through. In addition to that, there's a historical trauma of medical testing and experimentation on Black people's bodies in pretty recent history, and also from enslavement onwards. And so a very real embodied trauma around medical testing generally. Release, who I work with as a consultant as well, have incredible policy papers. At the moment, the only drug policy organisation that really have a racial justice focus in the UK. And this is their latest report, which talks about many things in terms of how this mechanism is operating. But one that really struck me was that there's kind of a winding down of the war on drugs generally in the UK. A lot of different police counties are kind of demobilising, they're deprioritising going after people for personal possession of drugs. But what Release have found is although stop and search has decreased for people generally in the UK, it's actually increased in communities of colour. So white people are being stopped less. But if you're a Black and brown person, you are more likely than ever to be stopped on suspicion. But what we also don't seem to realise is that Black and brown communities take less drugs than white communities in this country and in the US. But there is still the stigma and association of the drug seller being someone in a body like mine. Even though the higher up you go in terms of people who control drug networks tend to be white, and the majority of drug users are white. So there's a lot to kind of work through in terms of the social control elements around the war on drugs and the level of safety and agency that we feel around our bodies and relationships to these substances. So I think until the psychedelic community acknowledges the impact of this, ongoing impact, and until they take an approach which is based on repairing harms as a result of this, then there's going to be a lot of barriers, internally and externally, for active participation and engagement. One promising thing that is happening is the work that Monica Williams and her test site are doing. They had the first study in association with MAPS that was looking at PTSD in African American veterans, but also in civilians, and really kind of having an overlapping focus to see if the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy would work, but also if it could heal racial trauma specifically. So that's just the title of one of the studies, and this excerpt is just from an interview with Monica, who is, a really, really fantastic human. Unfortunately, that site, which was the only site MAPS was working with that had all POC staff and participants, has actually lost its DEA scheduling license. So they don't have the license anymore to actually handle the illicit substance. And so at the moment the research has stopped, which is a real shame. I think there is work happening to try and rectify that, but I think it does speak to where we're at, that there wasn't more kind of intention and resource around trying to ensure that this test site stayed open, despite the importance of the research that they're doing. So these are some of the challenges. I'm sure there are more, but some that have come to mind for me around the work to kind of make this medicine accessible and to really move towards healing racial trauma with psychedelics. So the test site in Connecticut has closed. So the one place that they are doing this kind of overlapping research is not happening right now. I think spiritual bypassing is a big barrier in the community, the research community and the kind of wider community. For those who aren't familiar with this term, spiritual bypassing is this idea that, well, when spirituality is used as an excuse to avoid talking about difficult things, such as oppression or violence or anything negative, it's just like, no, love and light, we don't talk about that, Or if we talk about that, we're going to manifest more of it, so we can't talk about it. And regardless of the viewpoint around this, because I'm not going to cut anyone down about it, we do need to have a certain level of conversation about these structural, data-driven realities if we want to create change. And even some of the research that's coming out of Imperial with Robert Harris, who's an amazing human doing incredible research. Some of the research coming out there are suggesting that if you take psychedelics, you inherently become more open-minded and more tolerant. I don't agree with this. Having come across enough psychedelic alt-right groups on the internet and psychedelic Nazism, I'm pretty sure you can take psychedelics and not be a left-wing person. So I think we really need to acknowledge this and kind of get to grips with the fact that you can have transformative experiences with these substances and heal and also still be racist or also still be sexist. They're not mutually exclusive. But if we perpetuate this idea that we just need to give it to everyone, put it in the water, give it to politicians, it's going to make everything better, but we're not actually doing the work of acknowledging that we're swimming in these systems, we're all part of them, and the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. Just the Me Too movement alone demonstrates that the psychedelic research community is not free of rape culture, it's not free of transgression. So I think we really need to try and do this work and understand how these social justice issues impact the research as well, and not just kind of point the finger and say, well, that's happening out there and it's not happening here. I think, again, this lack of awareness about racism as collective trauma is a barrier, because if we try and filter it out and think, okay, well, we'll do the healing here, that's politics, we're really missing a trick, because our bodies tell stories about our lived experiences. They represent what we're dealing with or not dealing with. And if we continue to do this research and have a healing methodology that does not acknowledge the fact that our lived experiences do impact and create trauma in our bodies, then how deep is the healing going to be? How culturally specific or relevant is it going to be if it doesn't also acknowledge the intergenerational trauma that our ancestors have gone through, and also give space for that? So I think that's an area that could really be helpful as well. We've already spoken about the lack of researchers from communities of colour or global majority that are in psychedelic science, and some of the barriers to that. I have a sense of nervousness about talking about these things publicly, even being someone just as a consultant within the research, because the kind of trauma and stigmatization and criminalization from the war on drugs is very, very fresh. It hasn't gone anywhere, even with decriminalization and legalization of cannabis. I think it's only in Oakland at the moment, in California, that they're thinking about reparations-based systems to actually get African American people into the cannabis market. In places like Colorado, you still have people in prison for personal possession of marijuana when there's white-owned cannabis dispensaries on the same corners they were locked up in. So this isn't a former issue, this is a current issue, and something which, in the cannabis arena alone, is proving that it hasn't been addressed. Just legalize it, decriminalize it. If we just do that without repairing harms and acknowledging these structural inequalities that have happened from the war on drugs, it's not a holistic or transformative change. Again, this cultural competency piece. A lot of mental health practitioners in this country and the US don't even acknowledge that racism affects mental health. I think for Black people in the room, if you've tried to seek out a therapist who has an understanding, is going to validate your experience, it's hard. Because in many traditional forms of psychotherapy, it's not acknowledged as a factor for mental health or anxiety or depression. Any of those books I've referenced, they have research to suggest that, but psychotherapy as an industry is so dependent on where that learning is coming from, and it's not often acknowledged. So we do need to have therapists who have an awareness of these social justice concepts and really how they map onto the body and how they affect our health and wellness and well-being. Okay, and yeah, really questioning this one-size-fits-all approach and trying to make models that are going to be applicable for Indigenous communities, LGBTQ+ communities, really understanding these different interactions of trauma will need different elements of care and intervention and support. And finally, corporate capture. It's already with the Johnson & Johnson example, it's happening as much as we might think that psychedelics are this kind of thing that's coming in the future. They're kind of, as far as corporations are concerned, they've already got their piece of the pie in the market. So I think as civil society, we really need to try and have more conversations and engage in how we want these medicines to be accessible, how we want these therapies to be held in our communities, and start doing that work now. Because otherwise in 5 years' time, it's just going to be a commodified, streamlined process. And I don't know if that necessarily feels like the win that everyone's been campaigning for all this time. So I think there's some work to be done there. Let's end with some hopes. So there does seem to be a growing mainstream consciousness about psychedelics in Black communities and spaces. Artists that I've been following recently, Little Sims and Janae Aiko, have pretty overt references to psychedelic use in their music and their artwork. And yeah, it does seem to be something that's being referenced a lot more in popular culture. Even in Burning Man, which has its problematic things, I'm not saying I advocate it, but even that is seeing a massive rise in participants of colour who I guess, are coming into those spaces and accessing different knowledges and pathways to this culture and psychedelic medicines. Decriminalisation effects in many countries. We've already talked about Oakland, but I'm going to say it again. It's a big win for Oakland today, because it also wasn't portrayed in this kind of psychedelic renaissance moment. It was portrayed as trying to decolonize indigenous plant medicine, which is what it is. These indigenous practices and access to medicines and entheogens is something which were just commonplace before colonization, and so it's just trying to allow people to have access to these medicines as they once did. And I think, again, understanding the relationship to indigeneity is really important in this work, because if we just believe the psychedelic revolution started in the 1960s, we're missing a trick. Because these medicines have been an inherent part of communities of colour for potentially since the dawn of time and human beings existing. So this is not new, this is a remembering that we have to honour the different pathways to these medicines as well. Growing awareness about trauma and its relationship to oppression. Even when Joy DeGruy wrote her book in 2005, there wasn't this awareness of kind of the neuroscience and mapping of the body and brain in terms of trauma. I think Bessel book came out in 2014, and that was pretty revolutionary, so it was kind of an exciting moment for these areas of science and looking into trauma to kind of understand what's happening on a more holistic level. We have the first MDMA-assisted psychotherapy training for people of the global majority. It's my preferred term, people of colour. That's going to be happening in Kentucky in August. I'm facilitating on it. I'm really, really excited. Monica Williams is going to be there, and it's hopefully going to be the first of many. We'd really like to have civil society generate the need to have this happen in Europe, because there are phase 3 clinical trials happening all over Europe, and the kind of European equivalent of the Foods and Drug Standards Administration have actually said they need to have over a third of the research participants be from migrant or non-white backgrounds for the European phase 3. So, yeah, there is a big call out on a need to kind of have Europeans and people in the UK understanding this is happening and hopefully shaping the conversation. Yeah, this is just a little flyer for that workshop that's happening. It's also, if you do know therapists, especially if they're from communities of colour, then please let them know this work is happening. Yeah, it's important that we try and have as many people involved as possible. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's any other challenges or inspiring things to think about at this point. I suppose in answering the question of the talk before we go into our final exercise, I think to me it feels very clear that psychedelic medicines are a powerful way to heal many forms of trauma, including racial trauma. And so I'm really, really welcoming more research that's looking at those specific overlaps, that's using the body, using somatics to explore that, because PTSD is incredibly prevalent in communities of colour. And I think for the piece I wrote for the MAPS Bulletin, referencing the Grady Project in Atlanta, African American youths there have higher rates of PTSD than veterans returning from war. So if we're really going to talk about populations that need this medicine, then we can't really leave out the racial component. And I really welcome more work that's looking at these specific overlaps, as well as the marginalisation experienced by many other groups. So as a final exercise before we go into Q&A, I'm having a little MLK resurgence for a moment in my life. I'm really enjoying this definition of power. So power, properly understood, is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It's the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. So I feel like us in the room, we have power. You know, we have different types of power. So I want us to spend the last moments just leaning into that a bit. And again, either pairs or threes, just thinking about what power do you have as individuals to start thinking about repairing harms and questioning dominant narratives in psychedelic research and really making this medicine more accessible to people, the global majority. What power do you have? And in thinking about power, it doesn't have to be grandiose things. There's a lot of power in our everyday interactions and intentions. So I'd just maybe ask you to lean into that for a few moments. Let me breathe into it. And then either in pairs or threes, I'm going to put the timer on again and just give you 5 minutes in total. No, let's do 6. If you're in a 3, you can have 2 each. To just, think about if there's one action point or intention you can take moving forward that you can do that maybe spreads this knowledge, that questions, they're like, well, we just need to all legalize it and give everyone psychedelics and they'll be left playing, or whatever it is. What do you have power over changing that maybe shifts this narrative? So decide who's going to go first, who's going to go second, potentially third for your threes. And the first person, your time starts now. Hopefully that's planted a few seeds of, inspiration or something that might be interesting to bring forward into your lives. We've got a little bit of time now for a Q&A.
So I've had a harrowing personal account of somebody who, with a diagnostic level of mental illness, who, having disclosed heroin addiction, feels that their treatment in an acute psychiatric setting was that they were given pharmacologically effective doses of medicines, and also by the GP in a less acute setting. So my concern would be treating professionals may, what's your sense that treating professionals may treat differently people with this kind of history, and not to give them access to individuals or psychedelics?
Yeah, that's a great question. At the moment, I'll summarize, yeah. The question was relating to professionals and whether the fact that a lot of people are excluded from research studies or from accessing medicine at effective doses if they have certain mental health diagnoses. Is that a good summary?
And heroin addiction is good as well.
Okay, and heroin addiction in the case of the person that you've referenced. There are different protocols in different places, so I can't speak to all of them, but I know in the context of MAPS that if you have certain mental health diagnoses, then you will not be able to participate in their studies. So currently, if you have schizophrenia, if you have borderline personality disorder, and a host of other mental health conditions, then you will not be able to participate because, yeah, I can't say more as to the specifics of why. Partially, it's probably because they want to have test groups that are going to be as manageable as possible within the certain parameters of PTSD, even though we know that PTSD can cause many other offshoots as well. And yeah, which is really unfortunate. And I am excited to see more studies happening that are going to be working with people with a whole host of different mental health conditions, and for there not to be such a limitation around that. I believe that there are lots of studies that are working with depression and suicidality, so that is happening, anxiety, and I think, yeah, specific conditions, but I know that there's a high prevalence of schizophrenia diagnoses for black people in this country, and it's a great shame to me that there isn't more awareness of thinking about how to, yeah, see if the medicine can be accessible in a research context. Who knows when it comes to market if that will shift, but I'm not really sure. And the conversation around it seems quite limited in the circles I'm in any case. So I feel like I've answered that as best I can. I do know that for opiate use, Iboga and Ibogaine are being used a lot for opioid addiction and have very, very successful results. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's been on the radar of the person you've referenced, but yeah. I'm going to try and paraphrase that. That's I'm going to try my best. So this wonderful human was saying that the World Health Organization has practices and guidelines around complementary medicine, traditional medicines from the African context, 10-year strategy around that. And so the question was asking about how we can get traditional psychedelics and entheogens included in that, and how we might make that accessible in the UK market. My initial gut reaction to that is that there's a lot of weight in terms of trying to have a civil society piece that is looking at specific research organisations. So the new Centre for Psychedelic Research that Robin Carhart-Harris is leading, I think if there was a sort of, collaboration between racial justice organisations, like Batten, the Black Asian Therapist Network, also other groups that are campaigning on the intersections of health, well-being, and sort of healing the effects of racism and trauma, it could be a strong case for them to see, okay, this is needed, this is desired, there are therapists who are willing to get involved and kind of be part of this process. Because I think at the moment, even if it's somewhere in the awareness that it could be something that's happening, they're not necessarily being met with the demand for it, of saying, like, we're ready for this and we need this. So that's kind of my gut response. Also doing the same with MAPS and saying, we need you to do MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trainings in the European context. I know in the question in regards to traditional medicines, it would be good to look into Ghana's approach, because yeah, they're very far along actually towards decriminalising all drugs. And I don't know if they're going to be working specifically around iboga or sort of reintegrating traditional medicines. I think there's a lot that could be gained from trying to look not only at Rema and Menakem's work, more on cultural somatics, applying that with traditions and movement-based practices that we've used culturally for a long, long time, pairing that with kind of more somatic healing practices that then could be added with certain substances, but not necessarily needing those, but they could be enhanced by, because I think the framing of mental health in a Western context is in itself colonial and very political, and so certain things that we deem as a mental health issue in an African traditional context is a spiritual issue, you know, or a spiritual thing that needs a kind of different container of healing. And so I often wonder myself whether I think the mental health system in this country is absolutely 100% failing. Having had several family members within it and a brother currently within it, it's not working for anyone. And I do wonder if, there's a need for kind of this ancestral piece to bring back in, the kind of practices that we were using before, and not expecting these issues to kind of be solved in a model that was not designed to actually heal. Us. So it's a bit of a convoluted answer, but hopefully thank you. The question is around healing white supremacy in white people and whether that's something that I can envision doing sort of somatic workshops around, because part of my day job is delivering kind of anti-oppression sessions in non-profits and usually using kind of more embodied approaches. It's something I've thought about and would be open to sort of collaborating on with a bigger group. I don't know if it's something I would do on my own at this point in time. But I think that's kind of what's necessary, is a more embodied relationship to this work. There are some organisations, and mostly in the US, that are kind of doing this, like White Awake, who have a Dharma approach to anti-racism, and they have a really great training, I think it's partially online, but they have meetup groups for as well, called Before We Were White, which is talking about kind of really processing and healing from the kind of intergenerational trauma that many white communities have, and the ways that racism is reproduced, unquestioned, and kind of dissociated from, and trying to have a kind of truth and reconciliation approach to that, with also embodied tools, using a lot of mindfulness, and really understanding where this stuff sits in the body. Because we can read all the books we want about it on an intellectual, historical level, but unless there's that embodied piece as well, I personally don't think it's going to move that far. I do know a lot of people who've had an access point to it from that. They've really gone into the literature, they've really gone into the history, and through that have then, started realizing there's always activation in the body, or things that are coming up, and then they start to do the body work. So there's different ways to it, but I do think that body piece is really important. And I think there is a space for psychedelic communities and even harm reduction services, such as the Zendo or other groups in the UK, to really start integrating more social justice processes into this work. And again, not assuming that the psychedelic space is a neutral space, but lovingly having strategies of intervention that, if someone is in a psychedelically altered space and is tapping into something that's quite hostile or aggressive, or is obviously linking to something oppressive or traumatic, like having strategies to navigate that and help move that in a way that's facilitated by the medicine, rather than just thinking, oh, they're having a bad trip, let's put them over here. Like, what ways are there to actually use that as a healing process and actually take it out of this current framing, which is about like recreation and fun and having a jolly. There's nothing wrong with that. But how do we actually create healing frameworks and protocols to do the work that we want to happen in our movements? So I really welcome more interventions and kind of research into that, and I hope that will be an area that other groups look into, and I'm interested in being part of it if that's happening. Thank you for that question. So to rephrase it, what kind of processes are being used to guide people through psychedelic experience? There's a reference to shamanism and the way that traditionally these medicines are facilitated and guided. And the question is related to, what are the protocols being used? Is that happening? I can speak to the context that MAPS are using. in the protocol they're developing. I've done my first part of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy training as more of a somatic practitioner, and so I've watched a lot of videos, sessions, and the protocol I think is really really rigorous in terms of creating a healing container for people that's very supportive but self-directed by the person and the experience. So a lot of traditional forms of talk therapy, you know, you go to the expert, they'll diagnose you, they'll tell you what's wrong with you, and they'll say, you need to try this, this, and this. The MAPS therapeutic protocol doesn't do that. You have two people, generally a mental health practitioner and a somatic or body-based practitioner with you. You have 2 sessions which are 8 hours long each. You have like a preliminary kind of talk session, and then you have follow-up and integration afterwards, but you have your 2 MDMA 8-hour sessions. And these people are in the room with you the whole time, unless you know one of them needs to go to the bathroom, but they're just there to support you. And it's directed by the person. So they're not going to say, hey, do you want to talk about this trauma thing? Or hey, do you want to do this? They really wait for it to come as it needs to from the person. They might suggest strategies to manage things that are coming up. They use a lot of somatic body-based tools. So if someone is getting activated, they might say, okay, do you want to like take some deep breaths in? Do you want to stretch? Do you want to shake? You know, they'll do a lot of that as well, if that feels necessary. They'll suggest. But the whole thing is set up to really be led by the needs of the person, and in a way, we're reconnecting to this narrative of having like an inner healing wisdom, an inner healing intelligence, which is a very kind of, I think, indigenous-based approach, more so than a kind of Western psychotherapeutic approach, where, you know, within the context of capitalism, we're told you need to see an expert. You can't heal yourself, you need to go see someone else. So this protocol is actually trying to bring it back to knowing that we as individuals have the ability, with guidance and support, to understand what it looks like to pass out this stuff. I think there are other protocols being used by different studies that I can't speak to as much. I think they're also researching, you know, how do you judge this? But there's also research going into the use of icaros, for example. There's medicine songs, traditionally used in ayahuasca ceremonies, and to see, you know, if that houses what the effect is of doing that, because unfortunately the more scientific protocols that are developed around these things, there's more of a kind of synthesis of extraction of like how can we extract the active components of this. And so in retaliation to that, there's kind of studies looking at what does it look like to really integrate this holistically in cultural context, and what are the benefits of that. So I think there's a lot of different approaches happening. But I think that with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy that MAPS are generating, there is a specific protocol that will be kind of packaged with that, and that may change once it's available for other organisations to put their spin on it. But I think in linking back to Stephen's question, there is an opportunity to, when people are processing and when they do get into those moments of talking and reflecting and piecing together their trauma and making sense of it, it inherently gets political. But MAPS currently have a bit of an apolitical stance, and I'm in no way suggesting indoctrinating people and saying, you need to be like this, you need to be like that. But it stays in a very individual level. For example, with veterans, they've been traumatized in the context of war. Many of them, after going through the studies, no longer agree with being in the military. You know, a lot of them have very big transformations. However, I don't know if in the therapeutic context they're being supported to look at the bigger picture of what that collective trauma is, or whether it stays at that individual level of like, I for me have healed, I for me have moved away from this, but I'm not going to question the container of the war machine, which continues to generate people in this situation. And so I think there is a space, there is a lot of discussion happening about what would it look like to create an ethical protocol that's framing, you know, certain parameters around guiding people towards really questioning these traumas and bigger structural power things in relation to themselves, and moving a bit further away from this individualized healing model. I have my trauma on my own, it's separate from everything. I go have my healing and I leave. What would it look like to acknowledge collective trauma and collective healing? I'm interested in that too. So the question is around, this idea of like how how effective is it and possible is it to have kind of collective healing with shadow work when so much of it is individual, and we often have a lot of individual shame and guilt that comes up. But in the space of MDMA, that can kind of reduce that and allow safety enough to explore certain things that are edgier. And so sort of this questioning around what it would look like to have a collective infrastructure if it's possible. I actually think it's very possible outside of a Western therapeutic model. So I'm really struggling to remember the name of the book. It's something like towards theologies of liberation. I don't think that's the right name of it, but it's about liberation. I really know if I can't remember the name of this. Basically, forms of therapy that have come out of the South American context that fuse art with therapeutic process. So when communities have experienced genocide, like big collective traumas that are not going to work because it's not accessible in most parts of the world anyway for people to see a therapist privately. It's just not. It's like a Western thing that some people do. And secondly, when the collective traumas happen to a whole community and they're all dealing with it, so what do you do then to actually navigate that? And so by fusing art and kind of truth and reconciliation processes and body-based things, whether that's group singing circles, movement things, rituals and community processes, there's a way that people are able to take stock of and understand, yes, their own individual subjective story, but how that relates to the collective and how they can all then heal together through that. So I'm really interested in those models and how we would apply that to a society or societies that are very individualistic and that we do have the benefit of having access to lots of kind of self-work and spaces where we can do that, and I don't think that's bad. And also in dealing with these more kind of historical, collective and intergenerational processes, I do think that a lot of that work needs to happen in community, or be reflected at least in community, whilst we do our individual piece of it, but I don't think it is enough necessarily to do it in isolation, because we only kind of learn to demonstrate the further action and learning in relation to other bodies as well. So,
do you think through the integration of those emotions and learning the shadow as a projection, so the things that I can't own and I project onto you or other social groups, would then lead to just the interpersonal space warming and become, and is that the most impact that we're able to have? Even though that seems small, that has a I don't know, I'm still rallying that idea in my own.
So just to paraphrase that, whether or not doing the shadow work and looking at the way we project onto others means that if we deal with that we can have a more kind of intimate, interpersonal situation and like undo that in the interpersonal realm. I think that's part of it. I mean, I think there's multiple levels and ways that we can connect with this stuff. So I know that there are people in my life who've never necessarily read books on critical race theory, but on an embodied level, they're comfortable around my body in a way that many people who've read all kinds of things in critical whiteness are not. And so for me, there's a body solidarity piece that's very important. How comfortable is someone's body in relation to my body? How much agency do they give me? How much do they feel entitled to grab or to take from me in certain ways? So there's that body piece that's really important. Then the interpersonal communication in terms of awareness, connection, communication, and other ways, I think is there. And then just how we use our power and our agency, whether that's in our sharing of resources, our organizations, our work life. I think there's so many different ways we can engage with it. And I think, I don't know, to get really hippie, but it's quite fractal and emergent. The more we do it, the more it can spread into these other facets. And for some people, maybe they're really good at doing it at work, but they go home and that's not what they practice. So, I think that integration is potentially infinite, but we need to have supportive spaces to do the work. And at the moment, I don't think there are enough spaces where we can even have conversations that are healthy about race or oppression, let alone healing from it, and how we support each other through it. So, I just think we need more support. I think everyone needs more support with this. Really good question. So to kind of rephrase that, Hollis was saying that for indigenous communities and traditional holders of this medicine, they understand that these are not just like chemicals, but plant spirits and entities that have agency and need to be respected, and they're having a dance and communication with us on a deeper level. But what space is there for that in the setting of the scientific studies that are happening? And what are the thoughts about that? Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of making the deal with the devil, really, unfortunately. MAPS, in order to do what they've done, have had to essentially work with the US military and specifically work with veterans in order to have the space to do this work, and they've had to create a protocol which is very rational, scientific, and does not have, at least ostensibly in the studies, room to acknowledge anything bigger than these things as chemicals, which is very easy to do when you're dealing with MDMA, but as they move into other substances, especially with studies looking at ayahuasca and iboga, I mean, it starts to get very prickly for me and for many people. There are those who are looking at more kind of traditional ways to do research, which tends to be more about the healing component rather than the kind of clinical testing of like how effective is this. At Harm Reduction International, there was a woman who was talking about the use of sweat lodge and some entheogens as healing practices for indigenous communities with PTSD. Really effective, we want to see more of that. But unfortunately, yes, the frameworks of science will allow us to legitimize and legalize these medicines, but then under what terms is yet to be seen. So it's a contentious and prickly area for sure. Yeah. I think that's all we have time for. So thank you so much for coming.